Zachy Hassan as your host on this most epic journey through pop culture's past. Hold on to your butts. This is Nostalgia Theater.
Brought to you by the Movie Film Podcast.
Hi everybody, welcome back to Nostalgia Theater. This is Zachy, and we are back with my friend Glenn Greenberg. Say hi, Glenn.
Hello there, Zachy. Hello there, everyone who's listening.
So Glenn and I had a blast last year talking through the pilot episode of the original Star Trek. We watched Where No Man Has Gone Before. I was going to say Where No One Has Gone Before because I've been watching The Next Generation lately with my kids. But of course, this is back in the 23rd century when we preferred gender specific.
When men were men.
When men were men. That's right. So you can listen to that one in the archives if you haven't heard that. But Glenn and I had a blast doing that. And then after that, we were talking about it. We were like, there's lots more Star Trek to talk about. And for me, Nostalgia Theater and Star Trek pretty much go hand in hand, which is either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on who you talk to. If you're my wife, it's a bad thing because I talk about Star Trek too much. And unlike Glenn, I don't get paid to talk about Star Trek. So that's I need to. That's one revenue stream I need to open up. But regardless, I was like, hey, I think Glenn, this started with, you were like, hey, we should talk through Star Trek 5, right? I think that's where it started.
Yeah, that's exactly right? What it was, right?
And I was like, yeah, it's a good idea. And then we were thinking about it, and I was like, you know what we should do? Because I'm like upping the ante, right? I'm like, why do Star Trek 5 when we can do Star Trek 1 through 6? And so that's what I'm like, you know what? We're going to do this. So we're going to do at periodic intervals, or let's not lock ourselves into a schedule.
Right.
But we're gonna do the first 6 Star Trek movies. That'd be a blast. And for me, honestly, I'm looking forward to sort of taking a back seat here and just listening to my friend Glenn to talk about what he knows far more about than me, which is the making of these movies and his insights into these movies. So these are conversations I've been really looking forward to having.
Oh, geez, I was gonna put you in the driver's seat and sit back and listen.
Who's helming the ship? Who's at the helm? Where's Mr. Sulu when you need him? So we are watching Star Trek: The Motion Picture. This is from 1979, December of 1979. I arrived into this world just a few months before this movie did.
Oh boy,
I know. So I have a special kinship with this. This was my first exposure to this franchise, and Glenn, as I recall, this was sort of your entree into the world too, right? Before you saw the show.
In a big way. No, I had seen the show, and I'd certainly seen the animated show, but I wasn't a fan. Okay. This is the movie that got me hooked onto Star Trek. Based on seeing this movie, and I have to thank my older sister Anne for taking me to see it. And watching this movie is what got me interested in Star Trek. And from that point on, I started watching the series more or less regularly. I certainly started buying all of the novels and the comic books after seeing this movie. And then Wrath of Khan is what made me fall in love with Star Trek. The motion picture was sort of like, a first date that went pretty well.
There you go. Yeah, and I think a lot of people would agree with you about Wrath of Khan. I think a lot of people would disagree with you about how much or how little they like the motion picture. It remains, even now, a pretty polarizing movie in some aspects of Trek fandom. I'm a fan of the movie. I enjoy. I celebrate Star Trek in all of its many flavors. I'm just that kind of a fan. But we are watching the theatrical cut. This is as distinct from the 2001 Director's Edition, which is not as readily available. It's not on Blu-ray, unfortunately. It will be soon, though, I'm sure. So we've got lots to talk about. We have the theatrical cut queued up. And just to give a sense of how we are, in fact, living in the future, I'm here. I mentioned this to Glenn before we started. I'm sitting in the closet, and I have Star Trek the Motion Picture queued up on my iPad, which I love the fact that Glenn and I are sitting on literally opposite coasts of the country. We both have the movie queued up on different ends, and yet here we are. We're about to talk about it. We are living in at least a part of the Star Trek future.
Very much so. Yes.
So let's do this. Let's do the countdown. We'll on 3, Glenn. So 1, 2, play on 3, and then we'll get into it.
Okay.
So, folks, if you are queuing it up and watching it with us, you can do that. Like I said, we'll start on 3. We're watching the theatrical cut before the overture. So, at the very start of the movie, there is an overture. We will talk through that. So that's where our sync starts. But you know what? If you're not watching, if you're just listening to this in your car, or just as you work out or whatever, if that is something that you do, being a Star Trek fan, I don't know, it's 50-50. We'll try to keep it engaging on that level as well. So with that, let us make it so. I'm jumping a generation ahead by using that quote. On 3, 1, 2, and 3. We are playing.
Okay.
And we are hearing the overture. This is one of the last movies to use an overture to get audiences acclimated. I don't know if it's the last. I want to say The Black Hole might have been the last movie to have a theatrical.
You may be right about that. Yes.
But this is some beautiful Jerry Goldsmith music. This is the Ilea theme.
And there are actually lyrics to it.
Oh, no. Are there really?
There are.
Did Gene Roddenberry write the lyrics?
Sean Cassidy, of all people, recorded it as a single.
Really?
Yeah,
wow.
And if you get the Star Trek the Motion Picture soundtrack, the expanded soundtrack that came out a couple of years ago from I think it was La La Land Records or something like that, it's included.
Really? You know, I have that album, but I have not. I guess I have not listened to it. Based on this shocking revelation that you just gave me.
You're not missing much, but if you have sort of like a masochistic curiosity, you can pop that in.
I can't even imagine. I mean, what I'm hearing in my head sounds awful. So
yeah, it's very 70s. It's just very, very 70s.
Now, did Gene Roddenberry do the lyrics to the Ilea?
I don't know. I haven't researched that, but I don't think so. It might have been somebody with in part of the Jerry Goldsmith organization.
Sure.
Maybe something like an associate of his, but. That's a good question.
Gene Roddenberry, we should, by way of context, he's going to be, I think, equal parts heel and angel while we talk through this. But, I mean, when I reference him writing lyrics, I mean, that's something that he is known to have done. He added lyrics that were never used to the original Alexander Courage Star Trek theme, and that was in part so that he could claim 50% of the royalties.
Right.
Which is kind of a heel thing to do. I don't know.
Especially when he didn't tell Alexander Courage, ahead of time.
Yeah.
Or after. Alexander Courage, the only way he found out, apparently, was when he was getting half the royalties that he thought he was going to get, and then confronted Roddenberry about it. And he said, hey, I have to make some money off this show somehow. Ugh. And Alexander Courage pretty much swore he'd never work on the show again, and only came back, I think, in the 3rd season when Roddenberry was no longer really there.
Wow.
He did one more episode after that. So
now the typeface we're seeing in the titles here. This is the first time we see sort of the distinctive typeface of the original crew that was used throughout the movie era.
Yeah.
And it's kind of fallen out of favor now, but I mean it feels pretty iconic to me.
Oh, absolutely. I loved it. And this whole credit sequence was done as sort of like it's so plain and so basic because the movie was so rushed as they were producing it, but I just got to say off the top of the show here, I am watching this version under protest. This is the theatrical version, as you pointed out. The director's cut, which was only available on DVD, is a much improved version of this movie. We'll get into that as we go along. I will say this Blu-ray it looks beautiful. It looks better than the director's cut. Yeah. But the problem with the director's cut is that all of the new stuff that they shot it in standard instead of high def because Paramount wasn't really looking ahead, and so they would have to re-render all of those new special effects again to do it for Blu-ray, and they just haven't been willing to pony up the money.
Which is sort of the story of this franchise when it comes to Paramount. I mean, they nickel and dime it at every point. I mean, we're seeing, to some extent, we're seeing that with Deep Space Nine and Voyager right now, where those are in standard def and nobody's willing to pay the money to up-res those shows.
Yeah. And also, I just don't think they think they're going to make enough of a return on it because those are like considered the lesser Star Treks.
Yeah.
The Next Generation is a big mainstream hit. Deep Space Nine, Voyager, not as much. So I don't fault them for sort of
I mean, they're probably right.
Yeah. But in the case of this is the first movie. I mean, this is Star Trek: The Motion Picture. They can't they can't see any way that they can make a buck out of putting the director's cut out on Blu-ray. It just boggles my mind.
Yeah.
But there are people who are going to hate this movie no matter what, and the director's cut is not going to win them over. But I think it is pretty much the definitive version of this movie. It has a much more balanced effect between the special effects and the human factor.
Well, and certainly it's the version that Robert Wise supervised. And it's one of the last things he did before he passed away. So
yes,
it has his imprimatur.
Well, he finally was able to sort of like put it on his resume, so to speak. I mean, for years, he never really talked about Star Trek: The Motion Picture. He would kind of like brush it off.
Yeah.
And after the director's cut came out, he was like proud to have made this movie.
Right.
So.
Now, worth pointing out here, the Klingon captain that we're seeing, that's Mark Leonard.
Yep. Sarek himself.
Yeah, so for a while there, he was the only actor to have played all three major alien creatures on Star Trek. He had been a Romulan and a Vulcan and, of course, a Klingon.
Yep. And, of course, this is the first time we're seeing the new Klingons.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because I think for a while there, we were meant to just sort of say, sort of like mentally imprint these current Klingons onto the ones from the original series. The idea that, well, they always look like this. It was just never referred to.
Yeah, well, Roddenberry once made a joke, well, there are northern Klingons and there are southern Klingons, and the ones in the TV show were the northern Klingons. These are the southern Klingons. We just never saw them before.
Right.
And that's the version. That's actually the explanation that I like the most.
Yeah, well, and I mean, they for a while there, they just they never addressed it, and then I think it was the fourth season of Star Trek Enterprise, they came up with sort of an in continuity explanation, which is it is what it is, I guess.
It is what it is. Now I just have to say, at this point here, there's this guy walking in right now. Commander Branch.
Yeah.
He was supposed to play the Vulcan character when Star Trek: The Motion Picture was still going to be a TV series, Star Trek Phase 2. That guy, Commander Branch, who's standing on the left of the screen, he was going to play the new Vulcan character, Lieutenant Zahn, because Nimoy was not going to be on the TV show.
Right. And that's David Gatrow.
Right.
And so this is his consolation prize. He gets to be
pretty much
sort of. He gets to be a red shirt.
From what I've read in this book called Return to Tomorrow, the filming of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, when Nimoy signed on to do this movie, David Gatrow knew that his days were numbered. And so, as you said, as a consolation prize, they pretty much gave him the last speaking part that hadn't been filled. Just to give him something, because he had stuck with it for so long.
And there's promo stills that are available. You can see him in his Vulcan makeup. He's got like a kind of a 70s Hardy Boys hairdo going on.
Right, which I doubt would have been on the show. I think that was just a makeup test.
I didn't know that, actually. I just assumed, okay, I guess they were trying to catch up to, the era.
No, my impression was that was just a makeup test. They hadn't cut his hair in the Vulcan style yet because they were just so far away from shooting that it was just sort of like an initial makeup test. The same way you could see initial shots of Persis Kambata wearing a bald wig.
Oh, sure.
As a makeup test, and there he is. the reason why this movie got made.
Yeah, well, and Robert Wise said he would not do it if Nimoy was not in it.
Right.
And
his wife said to him, "You can't have anything to do with this movie if there's no Spock. If there's no Spock, you'd be crazy to make a Star Trek movie." And then Robert Wise went to the executive Paramount and basically repeated what his wife said.
And he was absolutely right.
Yeah. Now, in the director's cut, as you know, this whole matte painting in the background has been completely changed. There's no other planets or planetoids or moons in Vulcan's sky, and the Vulcan looks much more in line with how it looks in the later movies and on the original TV show, with a red sky and more of a desert sort of landscape. And that red thing that we're seeing behind that bald Vulcan, you can see in the new shot in the director's cut. That's actually a statue of a Vulcan warrior holding like a weapon.
Now, the language that the High Priestess here is speaking was English in the original cut, but they just kind of garbled it up.
Mm-hmm. In fact, the subtitles match her lips perfectly. So in the director's cut, they changed some of her English dialogue in the subtitles so that it doesn't match as perfectly.
That's really funny.
So
now, in terms of the chronology, this is set about 2 years after the end of the 5-year mission.
3 years, actually.
3 years, but the film is 10 years later.
The film was made 10 years later. Yeah, so basically they're playing 7 years younger than they were in real life.
See, I wonder why that is. I wonder why they made that creative decision.
I've wondered about that. There's from what I can tell, there's never been a real explanation as to why they decided to make it 3 years rather than 10. It's a really good question, and I don't think it's ever been addressed. Maybe that book that I mentioned earlier gets into it, but so far it hasn't. I'm about 100 pages in.
It's interesting because The Wrath of Khan essentially adds an interim of time between the first movie and the second to sort of catch the characters up chronologically. Right. You know what I mean?
Well, maybe that, and maybe some of it has to do with they didn't want to portray these characters as being, as old as they were in real life. That might have had something to do with it.
That's possible, yeah. So right here, and yeah, as you mentioned, the director's cut adds a little bit more.
Well, because that shot that we just saw of United Federation of Planets,
that was like a filler shot, right?
Exactly what it was, apparently.
Of course, I saw this movie a million times when I was a kid. I never noticed any of that. Now I look at this shot and I'm like, man, here it is, the return of Captain Kirk. But one thing I always wonder is, did people at the time be like, what's up with Shatner's hair?
I remember reading in a fan magazine, might have been Famous Monsters of Filmland, that they actually addressed it. They said, why does Kirk's hair look different? And the excuse that they gave was, well, Bill's hair has changed since the 60s, and now it's much more puffier kind of style. And that's pretty much as far as they went. You just had to sort of roll with it, the same way you have to roll with Scotty's mustache.
Right.
Which apparently James Doohan insisted upon. He decided that he, just wanted a mustache, and Roddenberry was opposed to it, and Robert Wise said, "Who cares?"
Yeah, and I think that's a nice little marker that acknowledges the passage of time.
Yeah.
Now, what do you think of these uniforms? I know they're pretty polarizing. I have to admit I'm not a fan. I don't like the color range. I feel like it's a little too Space 1999 for me.
I love them from the moment I first saw them, the same way I loved, the new Enterprise from the moment I first saw it. I love them. I got used to them. I was, very disappointed when I first heard that they weren't going to be used again in the second movie. And then I saw the second movie and fell in love with those uniforms. So I like them. I mean, I know that they've been, joked about as, they look like pajamas. Interestingly enough, again, from this book, Return to Tomorrow, I feel like they should be paying me for all the plugs I'm giving them. But But apparently, Roddenberry did not like these uniforms. He thought they were too militaristic.
Militaristic,
Which-
wow. Well, he would have loved.
My jaw dropped.
Little did he know what was coming, then, right?
Yeah, I mean, my jaw dropped when he said that, and he said that in particular, Shatner's admiral uniform he felt was
the
particularly
dentist suit that Kirk is wearing right now. Yeah.
And so as sort of like and originally, according to Roddenberry, all of the uniforms were going to look like that, and then as sort of like a sop to him, they changed everybody else's uniforms and even Kirk's throughout the rest of the movie. Once he's no longer an admiral, he's wearing basically what Scotty's wearing here. But that really threw me. I mean, if he thought this was militaristic, his head must have exploded when he saw the second one.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But I like them.
I think for me, it's like I certainly I have a level of nostalgic attachment to them, but I definitely they just feel very rooted in the era. In a way that I don't feel the original series or the 1980s uniforms are. Mm-hmm. You know.
Well, there were a couple of things that I liked. I liked the fact that they kept that sort of neckline, you know, that sort of like almost like V neckline. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I liked the fact that they kept the rank insignias on the sleeves. It was very easy to figure out what each of them meant. It took me years, literally years, to figure out what all of the rank insignias meant in the Star Trek II era uniforms.
Oh, sure.
Like what the Admiral stars meant, what a captain's insignia meant. You know, it used to be very easy. You just look at the number of stripes on the sleeve, and that was it.
Yeah.
But I liked all of the movie uniforms basically.
Now, interesting to note that this movie is the first time that the Enterprise's logo became the Starfleet logo.
Right.
Because people forget that in the original series, the stylized arrowhead, that was the Enterprise's thing. That was not everyone else. And you know, right. I feel like that's kind of gone without comment. Like nobody kind of talks about how that was a major thing in the original series. Because if you watch, you know, the J.J. Abrams, the reboot films, they just paper right over that.
Right.
You know, the Kelvin crew in the before the Enterprise is
even built.
Yeah, they've got the Enterprise logo, right?
Yeah, people like John Byrne have brought this up, and one of those things is like if you try to focus on all of these contradictions and conundrums, I mean, you know, you'll go nuts. It's just one of those things. I mean, I think there was a memo somewhere where Roddenberry himself said that, you know, it's not necessarily the case that every ship has its own insignia. But, I mean, I don't know.
I mean, ultimately, bottom line, you're not going to improve on this logo. So
right. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the insignias that the other ships wear, none of them are as nice.
Yeah, they were all pretty terrible looking. They looked kind of thrown together. Mm-hmm. You know. Now we're talking through this beautiful effect sequence, and you know,
there she is.
I mean, this is my favorite Enterprise. Period.
Yes, mine too.
You know, I don't think. As much as I have affinity for pretty much every version of the ship, it doesn't get any better than the movie version of the original Enterprise for me.
Right.
And this piece of music by Jerry Goldsmith called The Enterprise is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the best pieces of music in the entire franchise's history. I can listen to it all day and all night.
I listen to it quite frequently, actually. And this sequence gets so much criticism for being overly long, and when they were making the director's cut, the people who were working with Robert Wise tried to get him to edit this down. And to his credit, and to his, you know, it's a testament to his wisdom. He said, "Absolutely not. I want it exactly the way it was." This is such a beautifully photographed and edited and sequence. I mean, it's just a beautiful sequence, and I can't imagine cutting it down. It's a wedding ceremony basically.
Yeah,
you know, Scotty is the best man, you know, escorting the groom to the bride, and the Enterprise is the bride. You don't rush a wedding ceremony. That's what this is. It's a reunion of a man and his great love.
Well, and Kirk is a surrogate for the audience who had been waiting, 10 years
right.
for something on this scale. And by the way, the motion picture doesn't get nearly enough props for being the only film in those original 10 that really lives up to being a big screen adventure.
Right.
Especially the rest of the original series movies were, they were made by the TV division, and they're fine. I'm not discounting the quality of those movies, but they don't have the scope of the motion picture. That's just a fact.
And part of it is because, Paramount, to a certain extent, learned the wrong lesson from this movie. It's basically, once this movie came out, and it did really well, it's still one of the most profitable ones that they've ever made, but the negative critical reaction, they were so skittish about doing anything with Star Trek after that the lesson that they learned is everything that they did in Star Trek the Motion Picture, we'd have to do the opposite. And so you did lose a sense of scale and wonder and awe after this movie, because they said, well, we tried it that way, it didn't work. Well, you tried it that way, and it didn't work because it could have been done better. I don't defend this film as being, a great movie or even a great Star Trek movie. It's flawed, but, given the resources, given a terrific script and the right director and the right, we could have had some mind-blowing Star Trek movies after this, but they were so afraid of having another experience like this that they just went completely in the opposite direction.
Which, kind of ended up working out okay as far as the original series movies. I certainly won't complain. And this is what I mentioned this earlier. Gene Roddenberry, depending on when we enter the story or which telling of the story, he is both heel and angel in this story.
Right.
This one
you
specifically.
see that a lot.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Well, and this one specifically, because Harold Livingston, who co-wrote the script, there aren't enough bad words in the vocabulary to sum up some of the ways he's described Gene Roddenberry, and then from what you have told me,
Yeah. Well, it's weird because according to that book, Roddenberry is the reason why Livingston was even on Star Trek originally, and on Phase 2, the TV series, and on the movie. When they were running into script problems during the making of this, it was Roddenberry supposedly who suggested call Harold Livingston and get him in, based on the work that he had done on the aborted TV series. So it's like Roddenberry's the one who got this guy his job, but also apparently made his life a living hell.
Yeah.
But supposedly, and again, this is according to Roddenberry, who, was never reluctant to toot his own horn. Right. But he was talking about a lot of the stuff that he tried to work into the script that kept getting taken out was all the things that the fans wanted to see in this movie, which was more characterization, more development of the supporting cast, more of those human moments that we loved so much from the TV series. And all that just kept getting taken out. Like, we just missed a scene right there where the crew shows their support for Kirk after he leaves the bridge. That got cut out. So according to Roddenberry, a lot of the stuff that, we complained about, he tried to address in his drafts of the script.
Okay.
And he was just fighting a losing battle. But again, that's his version.
Yeah, and I think that the portrait of the man that has emerged, obviously, in the quarter century since he died, is that he had an amazing vision that maybe didn't measure up to his talent. Didn't necessarily measure up to the vision that he had about this universe, and I think he was beset by his own sense of inadequacy, of having to measure up to that. I wrote an essay earlier this year about the film Star Trek: First Contact, and my contention in that film is that Zefram Cochrane, as portrayed by James Cromwell, is in essence Gene Roddenberry.
I read your piece. And I didn't disagree with that, to a large extent. And I thought you made some really, really good points. And in addition, and again, this comes out, it's not only on the Star Trek The Motion Picture, but when you read, the inside stories about the making of The Next Generation, his priorities were kind of, I guess askew might be the right word.
Yeah.
He kept pushing for this scene in the recreation room where he wanted to have all the different characters in the rec room when Kirk is showing them the V'ger when V'ger destroys the Klingon ships and Epsilon 9 and all that, and he wanted all the crew members to be wearing different outfits. So some would be in their uniform, some would be in their casual clothes, and he wanted to specifically to have some characters partially nude. To show that they're off duty, and hey, it's the 23rd century. We're not going to have hang-ups about nudity then. So why would there be a problem walking around with almost no clothes on? Now remember, this was going to be a G-rated film,
right?
But it took Robert Wise to kind of take Roddenberry aside and say, Gene, this isn't going to be a really big scene in the movie. It's not going to take up a lot of screen time. Do you really think we should devote so much time and effort and energy into that when this scene is supposed to serve just one function? And Roddenberry apparently thought about it. He goes, yeah, okay, you're right. But why did it take Robert Wise to point this out to him? You know what I mean?
Well, because I think in the hierarchy, Robert Wise is probably the only one who could point it out to him.
Right, but what I'm saying is, as the producer, as somebody who produced television and knows the realities of filmmaking, why is this even a thing? It's like why is he focusing on trying to get nudity into a Star Trek movie, or even partial nudity?
He was drinking his own Kool-Aid. That's my
right. Yes. That emerges. If you about the making of Next Generation, is he had this whole backstory mapped out apparently for Deanna Troi, that Betazoids are three-breasted and they do that and they mate and they go and he was telling this to one of the writers, and the writer was thinking while Roddenberry's saying all this, the writer's thinking, where the hell are we going to get into any of this stuff? All of this stuff is like X-rated stuff that you're talking about.
So funny.
We're never going to do an episode about this. Well, who cares?
Right.
So he was really, definitely drinking the Kool-Aid. He was deep in the weeds,
Wow. Now, this is Grace Lee Whitney. I think this is her only scene in this film as Transporter Chief Rand. Yeah. So she's been upgraded from, what was she? Yeoman, right? Yeah.
Oh, and the other thing, just to be specific to this scene, so that was Commander Sonak who died in the transporter room. According to the novelization by Gene Roddenberry himself, which is not canon. It's not canonical, but in his version of this story, which is the novelization, the other person who died in the transporter room was Kirk's ex-wife.
Is that right?
A fellow admiral.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So why was she coming on board?
She was coming on board apparently as a last-minute thing because they had been married for 1 year. In Roddenberry's vision of the future, you sign these marriage contracts, and you can sign it for a year, and then you renew. I guess you renew the contract every year if you want to stay married. And they had been together for a year, and she was beaming up to the Enterprise to have one last conversation with him before he went on the mission. There was a lot of backstory between Kirk and his ex-wife and Admiral Nogura, who's mentioned in this movie but never seen. And apparently Nogura used the ex-wife, who was a fellow admiral, as enticement to get Kirk to stay on Earth and not go back out into space. And sort of like the nickname that she was, called behind her back was, Nogura's staff whore.
Oh, wow.
And so she sort of was the inducement, Kirk kind of Nogura threw them together knowing that, Kirk will, stay on Earth where I want him. And he used her to do that. So when Kirk found out that he'd basically been manipulated, they had a falling out. And so she was going to beaming up with Commander Sonak to basically have a conversation with Kirk before he went off on the mission. And so she dies in the transporter room. But again, that's just a novel. But it does add this whole extra layer that was really interesting.
Yeah. Now, the people in this scene here are Star Trek writers. I think David Gerrold is in there.
Yep, he's
and
right
fans.
in the front.
And fans.
Yep. B. Joe Trimble, who formed the letter writing committee to get Star Trek a second and a third season. She's standing, I think, next to David Gerrold. Yeah, this was a big deal. They brought in a lot of fans and as extras, and apparently I think there was a guy in a wheelchair named George LaForge who Geordie LaForge was based on or named after.
Yeah.
I think he might have been there too. And there's
So there's a change between in this. Well, there's a couple of changes in this scene, but the dialogue that Commander Branch says, where he describes the breadth of the cloud, and he says, in this, I think it's 400 AUs or
no 82 AUs.
82 AUs.
82 AUs, and they cut it down to 2 in the director's cut.
So an AU is the distance from the Earth to the Sun. I think, right? So
I believe so.
So 2 AUs is still substantial.
Yeah.
82, yeah. It's almost too big.
82 AUs, I mean, that's bigger than the solar system.
Yeah.
Which is, that's ludicrously big.
Right. So this
is they were wise to cut that down.
So this is Epsilon 9. I think this is. We never see another space station that looks like this. I think this space station is sort of it owes more to kind of the way NASA had gone in the years since the original series, because there was a certain look for space stations in the original show.
Right.
And even after, I mean, because what's where Carol and David Marcus? What's that one called?
Space Lab Regular One.
Regular One, yeah. I mean, that doesn't, which, and they used that model again forever, basically.
Yeah, well, we just saw it a few minutes ago. It was the office complex that Kirk beamed onto.
Oh, that's right.
When he met, all they did was flip the model upside down.
Hilarious. I didn't even catch that. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Now, this here, they also cut out in the director's cut where Kirk has to kind of tell Uhura twice to shut the viewer off. Which, I'll be honest, that's something I actually liked in this version. It's just because to me, it's the argument in cutting it out is, it makes Uhura look unprofessional. I'm like, no, she's blown away by this crazy thing. I think it's a human reaction.
Well, here's this. There he is. He's finally in the captain's uniform.
Yeah,
and he's in great shape. He really is in great shape. And the thing is what I think that this movie, the director's cut, another way that it improves upon the theatrical is Kirk is a bit of a jerk in the theatrical version.
That's true.
And the director's cut softens his performance. When he snaps at Uhura, he spends the whole he drafts McCoy back into service and then spends the whole movie snapping at him or ignoring his advice. So why did you bring him back if you're not going to listen to him? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so what the director's cut did was, by cutting out that when he snaps at Uhura, viewer off, also getting rid of the "oh my God" in the transporter room sequence.
Oh my God, that great
what a terrible
Shatnerian delivery.
Yeah, that was not a good delivery. But also, him not just jumping down McCoy's throat whenever McCoy is doing the job that Kirk brought him back to do.
Yeah.
Out
of retirement.
And you could see, well, we're getting to that scene right now. He looks like he was having a good time, not in Starfleet.
In some 23rd century nightclub by his clothes.
Right. So I and the other thing is by making Kirk such an ass in the early part of the film, later in the movie when he starts to be, more like we know him, there's no progression. I mean, there's no sort of like, he gets from point A to point C, but we really don't get to see point B.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We don't see why he starts to sort of find his way back. So by softening him in the beginning, it kind of helps that narrative, I think.
I think you're right. It's the feeling of this movie, especially these early parts, it feels like like a TV reunion movie,
Right.
which is essentially what it was, right? Because they took the pilot of the show and just blew it up into what this is. But it's this was it in Thy Image? Was that the title?
It was In Thy Image. It was a story that very, very sort of briefly was written down by Gene Roddenberry. He handed it to Alan Dean Foster, who turned it into a synopsis. Back then it wasn't V'ger. I don't remember what the name of the vessel was in Thy Image, but it was trying to find its god, whose name was Ensa, N''S''A.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, and I think maybe it was Paneer. Maybe Paneer was the name of the vessel in Thy Image. Obviously for Pioneer.
Oh,
and
gotcha.
obviously NASA. And then what happened was Harold Livingston wrote the script for In Thy Image, and they tooled around trying to find a real killer script for the motion picture, and they just decided, we've got this pilot movie, why don't we just blow it up? And so it went rewrite after rewrite after rewrite, and most of the rewrites, did not have Spock in it because Nimoy was not going to have anything to do with this movie.
Right.
And he certainly wasn't going to have anything to do with the TV series.
And it's interesting to me that says something about Leonard Nimoy, that not only that he held out, but what ultimately got him on board. And I think that he was true to the character of Spock, to a fault, one might argue. But he was kind of, his whole position was, I'm not going to just walk in and walk off if there isn't any value in my being there. And that was his position as far as the franchise goes, right up until the end, up through generations, where he, they wanted him in that film, and he was like, no thanks.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of it, he was. It's funny reading the comments from 1979, 1980 in terms of why he was so reluctant to come back, and he was much more forthcoming in later years, and a lot of it had to do with, number one, he felt that Paramount was abusing his image,
right,
for marketing, for merchandise. And he felt they were making millions off of his face, and he deserved to see a piece of it. And so that was really the last piece of the puzzle to get him to come back. They settled with him, and they wrote him a check for whatever sum, and he accepted the check, and within 24 hours, the script for Star Trek: The Motion Picture was on his doorstep. That's how quick.
Yeah.
And then a couple of days later was the press conference. We're making the movie, and look, Leonard Nimoy's going to be in it.
Right.
So he didn't talk about that back then. That it was a lot of it had to do with these merchandising fees that he felt he was due. Also, there was a lot of bad blood between him and Roddenberry.
Yeah.
A lot. And of course, they were professionals, and they don't want to air their dirty laundry. So it wasn't until years later that he was willing to talk about it. So between all of that, and also the whole torture of putting the ears back on, he really was not enthusiastic about any of this. So but once he signed on, my understanding is that he was instrumental in finding a way to work Spock into this script and making it a Spock story as much as it is everybody else. And when you think about this, and when I was doing my blog entries about Star Trek and I wrote about this movie, it turned out to be one of the most important Spock stories in the history of the franchise.
Right. And when you think about where the cast was at this stage of their life, he was the only one really who, career-wise, he would have been fine had he not done this.
Right.
William Shatner himself has talked about how difficult his career path was before Star Trek came back, and he was living out of his truck at one point.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the the supporting actors. I mean, I'm fairly certain they would have come back, But Nimoy was the only one who, when you look at the arc of his career between Star Trek Season 3 and Star Trek the Motion Picture, he was doing just fine.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mission Impossible. He was a frequent guest on TV shows. He was on Broadway. I mean, he was doing Equus when they were, really, really trying to get him to do this. He was on Broadway. In fact, Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was the executive at Paramount in charge of this movie, flew out to New York to wine and dine Nimoy and basically do everything he could to get him to agree to this, because he didn't need it. He was booked. He was doing Invasion of the Body Snatchers,
that's right.
Which he was very, very good in. In fact, the guy that he made Invasion of the Body Snatchers with, the director, Philip Kaufman, he was going to direct an earlier version of Star Trek the Motion Picture.
Planet of the Titans, I think it was going to be called, right?
It was Planet of the Titans, I believe, and Kaufman was doing a major rewrite on it, and he was going to direct it, and apparently he and Roddenberry, Kaufman and Roddenberry, really did not see eye to eye on the project. But Nimoy...
He can join the club there, right?
Right. But Nimoy apparently was interested in doing that version. So
makes sense. Maybe that's where the seeds for them working together probably were planted.
Oh, I don't doubt it. Yeah.
And Philip Kaufman, by the way, did the right stuff, which I love.
Mm-hmm. And I think didn't he also came up with the story for Raiders of the Lost Ark?
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, we don't hear that much from Philip Kaufman lately, but yeah, I mean, he certainly got.
No.
Yeah.
No, not really since Henry and June, right? That was that NC-17 movie that he did like around 1990.
Yeah. So I mean, gosh, almost 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Now this scene, I remember as a kid. I just had no idea what was going on in this scene. And I'm also fairly certain that I don't know if wormhole physics is even remotely applicable with whatever we're seeing here.
No. No, because a wormhole would have, one of the things that they actually talked about is that a wormhole would have sent them to another section of the galaxy.
And it would have felt instantaneous to them.
Right. And so, part of the extra drama that they could have played with, if they had the will, was that they go into this wormhole and now they're much further away from V'ger, or the cloud, or the intruder, whatever you call it at this point, and now have to work their way back.
Yeah.
So to be in a wormhole and basically come out the same distance from, where you were, had you just sort of traveled outside of the wormhole, is kind of like it defeats the purpose of having a wormhole in the first place.
Yeah, it's like going through the Jersey Tunnel, basically. You're just
right.
It's an inconvenience,
Yeah, it's yeah.
Now, we haven't talked about Decker at all, or Ilea, but I'm going through the Next Generation right now with my boys. We're up through the 6th season, and my gosh, you can just see how Will Decker and Ilea are the prototypes for Will Riker and Deanna. Mm-hmm. This is another example of Roddenberry, not letting anything go to waste. Let's just repurpose that there.
Well, Ilea was one of the first characters created for the Phase 2 TV series. And so she was going to be an ongoing character. And in fact, my understanding is that Roddenberry originally was pushing for Ilea to survive the end of this movie.
Really?
That at the end of the movie, that she would reappear on the bridge of the Enterprise. I think if he was going to be involved in the sequels, I think, he had the plan that he wanted to, keep using her. Decker, again, was, basically Will Riker. He would have been Kirk's second in command. There was a lot of weird stuff going on, if what William Shatner says is to be believed, is that he was only signed... His contract for Phase 2, apparently he was only signed for 13 episodes. Now, originally, it was only going to be 13 episodes the first season.
Right.
But his commitment was for 13 episodes, I guess, with an option to renew.
Okay.
And according to Shatner, he kept seeing in the script that they were really building up the Decker character, and there wasn't a lot of Kirk. And Shatner's impression was that they were setting him up to be phased out.
Okay.
And that maybe at episode 13, Kirk would either get promoted to admiral or he'd get killed. And you've got this second in command who's ready-made to just slip right in and take over as captain. And so you've got somebody who's cheaper than Shatner, and probably easier to work with. And that, the cast would probably have a better time, working with. Because even the brass, the top brass at Paramount probably was, fed up with Shatner. But then a weird thing started to happen. Again, this is according to Shatner, is he started seeing notes from Roddenberry saying, come on, we got to get more Kirk in. We got to keep Captain Kirk standing tall on the bridge of that ship, And so the later scripts that were developed for Phase 2 started beefing up Kirk's part more. So apparently somebody talked to somebody, and the decision was, no, we're keeping Kirk. But Decker was going to basically fulfill the role to some extent that Spock did in that second in command, but it would have been much more of a teacher-student kind of relationship.
Yeah. See, and you know what's so interesting is you can see on Next Generation how there's a model for how that could work, where you have the XO and the captain with essentially these different functions that allow one to be highlighted versus the other. But for me, I can't see a scenario where Captain Kirk does the Captain Picard thing where he stays on the bridge of the ship and his XO is on the planet somewhere. Like, I don't, that's not in my capacity to imagine Captain Kirk doing,
I agree with you, and apparently that was something that David Gerrold was really pushing. I don't think David Gerrold was part of the Phase 2 writing staff, but he was certainly in good with Roddenberry at that point.
At that time, right?
At that time, they had worked together on the original series, and Gerald had contributed a few episodes to the animated series. So their relationship was maintained. And I think David Gerald really pushed for the concept that it's not wise for the captain to put himself in such risk by beaming down to the planet every week. It just doesn't make any sense, especially if he's beaming down with the first officer. It's like the captain's role is to be on the ship. And, he did a novel in the late 70s, early 80s called The Galactic Whirlpool, a Star Trek novel. And he made the point in that novel that, Kirk has no business beaming down all the time. He's the captain of the ship. And so,
which totally makes sense from a logistical point of view. He's right. I mean, it's absolutely sense. Right. From a dramatic point of view, maybe not so much.
Right, and I don't think Shatner would have gone for that.
Right.
I don't think. I think to some extent some of those Phase 2 scripts, and it's been a while since I've read the synopses for them, but I think they paid some lip service to Gerald's point, is that Kirk's not going to beam down every week. Some of the episodes are going to focus more on the ensemble.
Right.
And so on those instances, Kirk will stay on the ship and Decker will, be the man of action. But I don't think Shatner would have put up with that for very long, and either there would have been a breaking point where either, Shatner gets his way because they value his involvement, or they say, you know what, this Decker character is working out really, really well. Congratulations on your promotion, Admiral Kirk. Back to Earth you go.
Right.
And so they were trying to play it both ways, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, one wonders, like, it's impossible to know because we're talking about like an alternate history, but would fans have been okay with that, with Captain Kirk being diminished in that fashion?
That's a really good question. At that point, it was 10 years later. I mean, they had to do something to differentiate, original Star Trek with what would have been Phase 2 Star Trek. Otherwise, I don't know if the show would have succeeded if it had just been a continuation of the original. I think they had to account for the fact that times had changed. It was a different era. And you couldn't just do the same old, same old. So there had to be some kind of structural changes. But as long as they were good scripts, and as long as they, Captain Kirk had plenty of screen time in certain episodes, and they never lost sight that he's the man in charge, I think it could have worked. I mean, you look at episodes like from the original show, the Tholian Web. He's barely in that one.
Right. But it's a Kirk-centric episode. He's still at the heart of it.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. It's hard to say. I mean, quite frankly, I remember reading there's a book about Phase 2, and I remember, reading the scripts, and
that's
some of them were just
Judy and Gar Reeve Stevens, I think, right?
Yes, and it's a terrific book. And you look at the scripts, and you see that some of them are just warmed over original series scripts, with the same ideas used over again, and other ones were, not just run of the mill. And some were terrific. There was this one that would have focused on the Klingon Empire. It would have been a two-parter, and that was really, really good. But there was a Kirk-centric episode about him getting stuck back in time at the beginning of World War II. He's at Pearl Harbor. Okay. right before the Japanese attack, and it's sitting on the edge of forever all over again. It brought nothing really new to the table. So I think that if anything would have sunk Phase 2, it would have been the fact that the scripts just were not the most innovative and forward-looking stories.
Well, in that sense, we can sort of use the early goings of Next Generation as perhaps an indicator of what Phase 2 might have been.
Yes, very much so.
And they righted that ship.
Yeah, but they ended up using a Phase 2 script on Next Generation. A couple, actually.
I think two, yeah. I think The Child and Devil's Due.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
So...
Now, this is... I love... I love how happy everyone is to see Spock because, again, it's surrogates for the audience because everyone in the audience is happy to see Spock back. And then I would imagine that it was off-putting for the fans to see Spock being so sort of standoffish.
Oh, it was.
Yeah.
Oh, it was. Very much so. Now, remember, I'm about 9 or 10 years old when I'm seeing this, and I don't know Star Trek at that time nearly as well as I would later.
Yeah.
And I turned to my sister, who was a big Star Trek fan, still is. I turned to her and I said, why is he being such a jerk? Why is he being so mean to everybody? They're so happy to see that. And it took a while for me to understand the pain that he's in at this point in the story. And I think a lot of people were looking for an emotional payoff. They were not sort of taking into account what the story was about.
Right.
They just wanted the instant gratification of everybody's back together. Spock is going to, make a quip, and sort of make fun of McCoy, and and it's like it's not the reunion that everybody was expecting.
Right. Exactly.
And that was off-putting to a lot of people.
Now, in this scene here, we heard the Alexander Courage TV series music.
Right.
And if I'm not mistaken, this is the only time we hear that music until the 2009 movie in any of the movies.
With the Alexander Courage theme?
Not the fanfare, but the theme.
No, the theme is, well, actually, we hear it every time I think Kirk does a captain's log in this movie.
In this movie, right. But this movie is the only time, we never hear it in any of the other movies.
No, we do. We hear it at the end of Star Trek 3, once Spock is, remembering Jim. He said, "Jim, your name is Jim." And as soon as it goes to...
That's right.
And then we hear it again at the end of Star Trek 4, when they're on the New Enterprise.
Oh, my gosh, you're right. Okay, I stand corrected.
Yeah.
Well, we don't get the full... orchestral take on it ever until Giacchino.
Right.
There we go. There, I'm saving my answer.
It's incidental.
Yeah.
The way it is here, actually.
That's true. In this, it's kind of just like a little nod to this is you remember this, right? Kirk's doing his log, and I love this. He keeps telling Spock to sit down. Will you please?
Apparently, that was an ad lib.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
This is great. I love this scene because it's the trifecta. Even
Right.
while Spock is still being standoffish, he's still being kind of a dick to McCoy. I mean, it's what we know
Yeah.
from the show.
Well, they're broken. They're not a unit anymore. And again, that's something that a lot of people found off-putting. That the warmth is not there, and we don't see it again until much later in the movie. And by that point, the damage is done for a lot of people.
Yeah, right.
But once I sort of got this movie intellectually and understood what they were going for, I was like, okay, I get it, and it's valid. It's a valid point. It's a valid way of telling the story and bringing them back together. That they have to work at reforging those relationships.
Well, I mean, with that in mind, why do you think this movie is so polarizing, even this many years later? I mean, we're coming up on 40 years later, and it's not beloved. I mean, I think that's a fair statement. I think it's admired by many, but I think of those 10 original movies, it's viewed by many as kind of on the lower end of the spectrum.
Because, to a lot of people, it's boring. I mean, its nickname is Star Trek: The Motionless Picture.
Right.
And it's very talky, and it's not properly edited because they didn't have time to properly edit it. So you've got these endless shots of them staring at a view screen and with their mouths hanging open and talking about what they're seeing, and it could hold a crew of tens of and this on, and it just goes on and on and on and on. And the director's cut addresses a lot of that, but so number one, you've got the fact that it's very slow paced. It's more intellectual. It's telling its story from the head, not from the heart. You've got these conflicts going on between the characters that either aren't fully addressed or just kind of forgotten, or just it's all very much subtext and not right out in front. So you've got this conflict between Decker and Kirk, which is never completely resolved. You've got this conflict between Kirk and Spock, which is kind of resolved later on, but you've got this internal conflict with Spock, but it's so internal that he doesn't really talk about it, and you don't really see it externalized. Also the fact that the plot is basically, a couple of Star Trek episodes, recycled,
right?
And even including from the animated series.
Sure.
This is basically an amalgam of The Changeling, The Doomsday Machine, and Beyond the Farthest Star, which is one of the animated episodes.
That's the premiere of the animated series.
Yeah,
I think, right?
yeah. In fact, some of the visuals from Beyond the Farthest Star are used here.
Oh, how funny!
The scene where they get out of the ship and they're walking along the surface.
Yeah,
of that.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
So it's I think people were expecting something more human, something more emotional, something more character driven, and something just a little bit more innovative in terms of the story. I don't think they were looking for something that says, maybe the connection between man and machine is going to continue to evolve, where at some point we're not going to be able to tell, one from the other. I just don't think that's the theme that people were looking towards. That's not something that really grabs you by the gut,
right.
and you walk out of there saying, "Wow, I'm really emotionally satisfied."
And
yeah.
Well, no, and just picking up on that, I mean, I think, it's still a Star Trek story.
Very much so, yeah.
Right, because Star Trek did have plenty of stuff from the head and plenty of stuff from the heart. So there was always a balancing act in the original series. I think, I think it comes down to execution to some extent,
Yeah. Oh, I think they could. I think a big problem was they were recycling, 2 or 3 old plots.
Yeah, so what do people call it? Where Nomad has gone before? I think that's one of the
right.
names.
Yeah, where Nomad has gone before. Absolutely. And but I just think with the tools that they had, they could have done a real kick-ass Star Trek movie. But again, it's hard to level blame, because this wasn't just Roddenberry acting in a vacuum, deciding, well, this is what I want to do. He had to answer to the studio as much as anybody did. And the fact of the matter is, they had pitched all these different ideas for a Star Trek movie, and the only one that the Paramount execs gravitated towards was this plot, because Earth was in jeopardy.
Right.
And they felt that, to bring non-Star Trek fans into this, there had to be something that non-Trekkies could relate to, and that is Earth is in jeopardy. And they save Earth. They've never done that before in such a direct way. Right. And so you'll get to see Earth, and you'll get to see what Earth becomes in the 23rd century. And now Earth is, your home planet is in jeopardy, and these are the characters that are going to save it. So that was the plot that was the only plot that the Paramount execs really sort of would go with. So it wasn't just Roddenberry. I don't think this is necessarily the script that he wanted to do for the first Star Trek movie. In fact, I know it wasn't, because his original script that he wrote, which was rejected, you may have heard about this, the God Thing.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean,
there was no universe where that movie would have gotten made.
Well, it did. It was called Star Trek V: The Final Frontier.
Touché.
But a lot of the ideas from the God Thing made their way into Star Trek: The Motion Picture. In fact, people have wanted for years to read the script for the God Thing, and the very few people who've actually had a chance to read it said, "Well, you already have. It's called Star Trek: The Motion Picture." Apparently, that's how similar it was. But what Roddenberry's idea for this was that God himself comes back to Earth.
Right.
And it turns out that God was a machine that has visited Earth several times throughout history, and it comes back and it's almost like the monolith in 2001 that kind of helps us along at key points in our evolution. But the machine is like sort of skipping a beat. It's like a record player that the needle just keeps going back to the beginning and sort of like repeats itself. So it's caught in like this perpetual loop, and so it needs to be repaired. And that was his premise, basically, that what we interpreted as God was this incredible, vast machine being, which, again, and Roddenberry even suggested that it might have been the devil. That this machine was actually the devil. It was never really God. It was, if for all intents and purposes, the devil, which absolutely was Shatner's idea for Star Trek V.
For his original idea,
yeah. And and that was Roddenberry's initial idea, and then they brought in Harlan Ellison, and they brought in the guys who wrote Planet of the Titans, which was sort of like a time travel movie that would have revealed at the end that the Titans of myth was actually the Enterprise crew caught back in time. And they're the ones who basically bring fire to humanity. So they tried all these different stories, and the only one that the Paramount execs, I guess, was back at that time. It was Michael Eisner and Barry Diller, and Charles Bluedorn was the head of Paramount, Gulf and Western, and this was the only.
I think, was in there somewhere.
Yeah, Katzenberg was the guy in charge of the production, but I don't know if he had any role in choosing the script or the story.
Okay.
But Roddenberry, didn't have final say over this story. He didn't have final say over the script. So, it was tough. It was a challenge, and there's not any one person you can just sort of point the finger at and say, well, this is the reason why it was somewhat of a disappointment. But I think that those were some of the things that it had going against it. Is that it wasn't the most innovative story. It wasn't well edited because they were just scrambling to just get it done. They never even did any test screenings for it.
And it's a lot of this, what we're seeing right now, which is looking at people looking at a screen.
Right. It's a very passive experience because they're passive.
Yeah, and they're trying to replicate sort of the visual awe of David Bowman's journey through the Stargate at the end of 2001, but without the dramatic context that leads up to that moment. It just feels kind of like you're watching the clock a little bit.
Yeah, and it must have been tough for Doug Trumbull because he's like, I did this already, Right. It's like, all right, I guess I can improve on what I've already done, but geez, And the visuals are great. I mean, this is certainly a step forward from 2001. But it is again. I mean, look at this. You just cut back. We've seen Sulu staring at the screen. We've seen Ilea staring at the screen. And this goes on and on for these long sequences where there's not any dialogue, there's not any character interaction.
Jerry Goldsmith earned his pay, though.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But I remember before the advent of at least in my house, before the advent of VHS, my father took a few years to get onto the VCR craze. Yeah. And so what I did was when ABC broadcast this movie for the first time in that special longer version, and I taped it on audio tape so I could listen to it. And so there would be these long stretches, and imagine I'm not visualizing and I'm just listening to it. There's no dialogue.
Yeah. So yeah, you basically got the soundtrack album along with the.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, the director's cut goes a long way towards improving the pacing of this, and it cuts out a lot of the repetition and the redundancies, and really it moves at a much steadier clip. I can't say for certain that all of these special effects moments were edited out or trimmed down or whatever, but it just feels like it's much better paced.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that if we're looking for kind of a narrative flaw, it's that it takes too long to get to sort of the heart, the metaphorical and literal heart of the story, which is here. I mean, we're about an hour in, and it just, I feel like they could have been more judicious in getting there, and I think, the as a result of sort of the leisurely build up, the final twist of what V'ger is not as sort of mind-bending as it might have been. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and again, as a kid, and it took me years, and it probably wasn't until I really got to see this again in pan and scan version, but, certainly as a kid seeing this for the first time, I didn't realize that what they're seeing on the screen right now is V'ger. I just thought that was this is just, an element of the cloud that they were just flying through. It just, none of that was very clear to me.
Yeah.
And what I love about the director's cut is they added some shots that give it some context, so that you do get to see the V'ger exterior, especially towards the end when V'ger is approaching Earth. There's this extra shot where you see the vessel approaching Earth.
Right.
That's not in the original. And I was like, oh my God, that clears up everything.
Right.
Now I get it,
The cloud is gone, and it's just the thing at its center.
Right, exactly. And you see the vessel, and it gives you some sense of the scale, and it gives you some sense of what the shape of it is. That's the other thing is, you never get to see in this version the V'ger in its entirety. It is this sort of like very imperceptible object that you can't ever get a sense of what it is or what it looks like or what its silhouette is, and they address that in the director's cut, and it made a world of difference, especially to me.
So we're now. This is the central core, if you will, of what V'ger is.
Well, it's the front. I think this is the front of the vessel.
Okay.
This is the very front of the vessel, and now the Enterprise is elevating. It's going up, and this is now the Enterprise's point of view of V'ger, and so they're on a parallel course above the V'ger vessel, and they're going from the front towards the rear.
It's so interesting because the backstory of what happened to Voyager is only alluded to, via Spock's, when he goes on his little journey through there. But I mean, that's something I would have loved to seen fleshed out in some later form. There are fan theories that it's the Borg, that the Borg. Right. Set V'ger loose or whatever, and I love that it's ripe for postulation, like, oh, what is this? Because it's if nothing else, it's a progenitor to kind of what the Borg represent. I don't necessarily think it's actually the Borg, but that same idea of a machine intelligence.
Well, that actually Roddenberry actually suggested that perhaps it was the Borg that it was the Borg planet that Voyager landed on, and they're the ones who rebuilt it into this. That actually came from Roddenberry. I
didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, I think he remarked that he made that remark at a convention, and certainly some of the fan stuff seized upon that and really had a great time with it.
I mean, it's as good a theory as any,
Yeah. I think to some extent, the name V'ger is toxic. I mean, nobody wanted to ever do anything again. It's like, they named a whole ship, a whole series called Voyager.
Yeah.
Now, would you want to serve on a ship named Voyager with a history of, and that seems to be sort of like a curse. You wouldn't want to serve on a ship called the Titanic. I wouldn't want to serve on a vessel that got caught in a black hole and was sent to the other side of the galaxy for 300 years. And then the fact that nobody ever made any reference, as far as I know, V'ger was never referenced again.
And honestly, I thought that was a missed opportunity on Voyager to not have Voyager meet V'ger. Like, let's see what this life form has become 100 years later,
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because when I was working on the Star Trek stuff for Simon & Schuster, I wrote 2 ebooks for them set in the Next Generation time frame.
Okay.
And I had pitched a story called V'ger 2.0.
Oh, wow.
And my editor, Keith DeCandido, he liked it, and he felt that it would have fit in really well with the series that he was editing. Paramount rejected it, and I'm not sure why. I don't remember exactly why. But I remember it got pretty far along the approval process until somebody just said, "No, we don't want to." I think it was that we don't want to establish anything specific about the nature of V'ger and what it became after it evolved into what it did.
That's
so. I got pretty close.
Yeah, wow.
If anybody would have ended up doing it, it would have been me. Oddly enough. But it didn't happen, and it's probably for the best.
Well, and I wonder if, again, that has a lot to do with just sort of the reputation of the movie.
Mm-hmm. It might. That might have been a very polite way.
They did Probe. I think it was a novel about the Star Trek 4.
Right.
So I mean, clearly there's a willingness to flesh this stuff out.
Yeah, I mean, my thinking at the time was it had been so many years since V'ger that they couldn't possibly have a problem with it still.
Right.
So, on the one hand, either they were just being very polite to me and giving me, sort of like the polite reason for rejecting it, or they were like, no, V'ger is still toxic. But either way, it was an idea that I had, and I would have played with it, and, it would have been interesting. But, I think maybe in the case of V'ger, it might just be better to sort of use your own imagination. Because anything that anybody says or establishes is only going to be a disappointment.
That's true.
So
So this is, I remember when I was a kid, they actually showed this movie on TV in Saudi Arabia, and they played it over 2 nights. And I always remember in my mind that this sequence, right, where the point where Ilea gets vaporized is where they cut it. And then part 2 picked up as her tricord or whatever falls on the seat. I remember that. We owned it on VHS, so I knew the movie very well, but I remember when they showed it on TV there.
Mm-hmm.
It was heavily edited, as I recall. Mm-hmm. There's like shots in the early part where women have mini skirts on and stuff, and those were mysteriously absent.
Oh, that's funny. And this was rated G originally.
Yeah, but not G enough for Saudi Arabia. So.
Well, it's funny. The director's cut, which is virtually the same thing, it's PG.
Really?
And I thought that was really, really interesting because it's virtually the same movie, just a little bit re-edited and with a couple of extra bits of special effects and stuff like that. There is nothing added to this movie that I could imagine would make it PG, but the director's cut is PG.
You know, what I would guess is that based on today's standards, even this cut would probably be PG. And because of stuff like what happens to Ilea here, and like it might be a little intense for little kids.
Maybe so.
Because I'll give you an example. Because I was just watching Superman the movie yesterday, and my nieces were over, and the younger one, she's about 8, and it's the scene where Lois is hanging from the helicopter. I mean, the big, right before Superman shows up. And the 8-year-old was like freaking out.
So, it's funny. Yeah. I thought you were going to, as soon as you started to say Lois, my mind immediately went to Earthquake, her trapped in the car.
But we hadn't even got there.
That to me is much.
Yeah,
huh?
We hadn't even got there.
That to me was much more disturbing than the helicopter.
That disturbs me now. But that's my point: is that if an 8-year-old is looking at the helicopter scene and freaking out,
right?
And that's
that's a really good point.
The original Superman is G, I'm pretty sure.
No, I think it's PG.
Oh, okay. That would be like PG-13 now,
Wow.
Well, maybe not PG-13, not the original one, but it would be made to be.
Well, certainly Man of Steel must have been PG-13.
But isn't it funny how like the scene with Lois in the earthquake is like far more gripping and terrifying than any of just the disaster porn in the third act of Man of Steel?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. because it's focusing on it's not some random cannon fodder. It's somebody that we actually care about. Whereas in Man of Steel, it was all cannon fodder.
Anyway, speaking of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, sorry.
That's right. Yes. Thanks for getting us back on track. So now they're getting pulled into, and again because the screen is absolutely filled with surface, so you don't get a sense of where V'ger ends and space begins. It's very, very vague.
Right.
And Mrs. Shatner just walks onto the stage.
So that was his wife at the time?
Yes, Marcy Lafferty.
Oh, how funny! Wow.
Yeah.
And then his daughter is in Star Trek V.
Right, she's a yeoman. Yeah.
But that's his kids are from his first marriage.
The kids are from the first marriage, right? Yeah. But Marcy Lafferty was who Shatner was married to at this time.
They were married for a while.
Yeah, I think about 10, 15 years.
Yeah, because basically through the movie era they were married.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm going from memory because I read his books, his memories books.
Right.
And he talks about at the tail end about how his marriage was breaking up.
Right. Yeah. Around the time of Star Trek V, it was starting to unravel.
Yeah. Those books are great, by the way. I'm sure you've read them.
Oh yeah, yeah.
They're great reading, but my understanding is that he was exactly as Shatnery in those books, in that he inserted himself into things that he wasn't there for, and
you're right.
Sort of made himself the focus. I mean,
which blew my mind that he and his co-writer thought that was a cool thing to do.
That boggles the mind.
he was taking other people's anecdotes. He would interview people and get their anecdotes, and then take them out and put him in their place.
Yeah. Now, I mean, let's talk about William Shatner a little bit, because I mean, I think I can't think of another example of an actor whose persona is so at odds with his legend, I guess. You know what I mean?
Yeah. He's beloved by so many people for his work, but if they knew the real person, it's. I mean, is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah. Just, I mean, it's. I mean, I don't think we're speaking out of school to say that he's not exactly revered by his castmates.
Right.
And
he's a difficult guy. I mean, I think he's reached the point in his life where he's willing to at least accept the possibility that maybe. You can see how many qualifiers I'm putting in here.
Yeah.
I think he's accepting the possibility that maybe at some point over the years he might have rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. I think he's willing to acknowledge that at this point, but I don't think he fully accepts it, and I don't think he fully understands why.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of narcissism there.
Well, and by way of a recent context for me, last week was the Silicon Valley Comic-Con, and they had the Star Trek Next Generation casters there for the 30th anniversary, and William Shatner was there also, and he was moderating a Q&A with them. And so I had purchased some autograph tickets and stuff to meet some of the TNG crew, and my boys, who I mentioned, I'm going through it, they were really excited about that. And my oldest, who's 10, was like, "Oh, can we meet William Shatner?" And I had to give it a lot of thought, because I was just like, first of all, it's like very expensive to meet him, number one. Mm-hmm. But number two, I'm like, I don't want them to have a not great experience with him.
Right.
And have that be their memory of him. You know what I mean?
Well, I will say this. The weekend before 9/11, it was the 35th anniversary of Star Trek, I guess it was.
Sounds about right, yeah. 2001, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
My wife, as a birthday gift, because my birthday was just a few days earlier, as my birthday gift, she took me to the Creation Convention in New York City. Shatner was the guest of honor.
Okay.
And she paid all the expenses. We got in to see his Q&A and to get autographs from him. Okay. I have to say, during the Q&A, he could not have been more funny, more charming, more patient with some really, out there folks.
Yeah, Star Trek fans asking questions is not fun.
No, but he was terrific with them. I mean, he was patient, and there was this one guy who was it took him 5 minutes just to get to the question, because it was all preamble.
Ugh,
I know there's a lot of Star Trek fans do that too. They have to explain why they're asking the question before they actually ask the question. And he's going on and on and on, and people in the audience were saying, "Get to the question already! Come on, get to the question." So Shatner gives this guy basically enough rope to hang himself, right?
Oh, boy.
And then finally Shatner just says, "I think I speak for everybody in this room when I say, what's your question?" And I burst out laughing. I mean, if anybody audio recorded this, you would hear me like just bellow out in laughter, and everybody started clapping. He was hilarious. He was terrific, for the entire Q&A session. Mm-hmm. During the autograph thing, he wasn't the most gregarious, if you tried to sort of have a little moment with him, he was very sort of, standoffish, or very sort of abrupt, or
sure.
Just short, not rude, but short. In contrast, a bunch of years later, I saw Patrick Stewart at a convention. Actually, it wasn't years later. It was not too long after. Actually, okay. It was around the time of the first X-Men movie.
Oh, okay. And that would have been before that then.
Oh, maybe I'm getting the chronology wrong. But just to sort of get to the point is that Patrick Stewart was very abrupt and
really?
Very sort of snippy and
oh, wow.
not particularly endearing to the crowd. He was very impatient. If he didn't like the question, he would go, "Oh, your question is so boring."
Oh, wow.
You know, "Oh, these questions are so boring. What's my favorite episode? Oh,
wow.
Can't you come up?" Yeah, I swear. That was one of the questions. What's your favorite episode? And he was like, "Oh, these questions are so boring." And then somebody else asked, if you could change one thing about Captain Picard, what would it be? He goes, "Oh, these questions are so..." And then he ended up leaving about 10, 15 minutes early.
Good Lord.
The audience is sitting there like, our beloved leader has abandoned us, kind of thing. You know, it was like, wow. William Shatner came off better than Patrick Stewart.
Wow.
I couldn't believe it.
That's a twist ending. Wouldn't have expected that. Wow.
Me neither. Not in a million years. And yet I hear nothing but great things about Patrick Stewart. Maybe he was having a bad day,
Right, yeah.
But,
yeah, I mean, I at this convention last week, because as a general rule, I don't go in for the autograph signings and stuff. But I wanted my kids to meet them, and I got to spend several minutes talking to Jonathan Frakes, and just, man, what a really nice guy, and we had a really interesting conversation. So cool.
I hear he is wonderful.
Yeah. I think he, from what he said, and this kind of relates to what we're talking about here. I was like 30 years ago, could you have imagined that you're still here? There's new fans, and it's something that's it's never slackened. Mm-hmm. And he said, I never would have imagined it, but. What I told him was what I like about the next generation. I've used this phrase online. I call it competence porn.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's just, you watch people who clearly they like being with each other and they like doing their jobs, and we get to just watch that. And he says, it's true on screen, but it was true off screen. He says there's lots of Star Trek casts, but none of the other casts get together for dinner every few months.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think they probably were the closest cast off the screen.
Yeah.
I think it shows. I mean, I'm not the biggest Next Generation fan.
I know this. And yet we're still friends, Glenn.
What's that?
And yet we're still friends, Glenn.
Well, it's all the same family.
Yeah.
But the one thing I'll say is that the camaraderie between those actors.
It's palpable. You can tell.
It's palpable, but what makes the original series more impressive is that they were able to act like that, like they were great, a cohesive whole. That makes the original crew actually better actors, because it was more of a challenge for them to put that on the screen.
Yeah. Well, and we talked about this, I think, in our last commentary. But there's this sense, among the supporting players, that Shatner kind of was like, well, they're like the secondary players, and I'm the star, and they held that against him, and I'm like, he wasn't wrong for doing that, because that's
right.
I mean, none of them were even in the titles.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this isn't in any way diminishing Nichelle Nichols and George Takei or whatever, but they're, it would be like, if we're talking about similar shows of that vintage, it would be like, Commissioner Gordon being upset with Adam West.
Right.
For, what was his name? Was it Napier? It was something Napier, right? Alan Napier? No, he was Alfred. Who was Commissioner Gordon? This is going to bother me.
Oh, boy.
I know, right?
That wasn't Stafford Rep, was it?
No, he was Chief O'Hara.
Was it Chief O'Hara?
Yeah. Anyway, but that's my point, right? I mean,
Hamilton.
That's right.
Oh, boy. I just fried my brain.
we're losing it, man.
Yeah.
But that's, I mean, it's as far as Shatner's concerned, if you're 1960s William Shatner, you're like, look, I'm the star, and here's Nimoy, and now DeForest Kelley. And those are the ones he was close to.
Right, but I think if you read their accounts, the people in the supporting cast, I mean, they went into this, to be fair to them, they went into it thinking it was going to be an ensemble. Now, maybe that's the way Roddenberry sold it to them, know, and the practicality of it was, as the show got closer and closer to becoming a reality, it became clear there's going to be, one star and two co-stars. But they went into it, I think, at the very least, Nichelle Nichols went into it thinking it was going to be an ensemble. and naturally she was going to be very disappointed.
Yeah. In other words, they expected what the Next Generation was.
Yeah.
And
who knows?
I wonder if the construction of the Next Generation was to prevent a Shatner-ish situation from happening, where there was a much more egalitarian mix right from the jump.
Well, all of their names are in the beginning, right? Of credits on Next Generation.
Yeah.
Well, that tells you something right there.
I mean, it's starring Stewart and Frakes, and then it's co-starring everybody else.
Right.
Which is also very interesting that they did that.
Yeah. Maybe so, because I mean, Roddenberry was still very much in charge at that point. Maybe that's exactly what he was trying to avoid.
I mean, that seems like a reasonable read on that, probably.
Oh yeah, and the fact of the matter is one of the things, before Roddenberry knew he was going to get sort of kicked to the curb after this movie, and he was planning a Star Trek sequel to this. One of the first things he said was the next one is going to be very much more intra-crew. That's exactly his wording. It's going to be much more intra-crew. So he had already, sort of hit upon the fact that, we really, really underused, these supporting players in this first movie. I'm going to go out of my way to correct that. Now, obviously, it didn't happen.
In any of the original movies, really.
Until really 4,
I would say
you
4
can make a case.
Yeah, and even that, I mean, it's kind of like everyone gets like one scene.
Right.
That's theirs,
Right.
And
Right.
just to pick up on that, I mean, I think this conversation we're having now also illustrates why the original crew worked better on movies, I would argue, than The Next Generation did. Because the original show was constructed around the triad.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we brought them over to the screen, we didn't notice as much the fact that these other characters were getting relatively short shrift.
Right.
Whereas,
well, look what happened. I mean, I think we actually talked about this last time. Was look what happened when they made the jump to Next Generation. I mean, why was Dr. Crusher even there?
Yeah. Why was
in the
Worf
movies?
there,
Yeah. I mean, to me, the most egregious example. Now, that is the weirdest Vulcan nerve pinch I've ever seen.
It's like vaguely erotic.
Yeah. What the heck is going on under the screen? But I think to me the most egregious example of that was in First Contact, where you've got this new character who's known Picard for what, 5 minutes?
For like a minute and a half.
Psychoanalyzing him and telling him that he's obsessed and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, excuse me, that's Dr. Crusher's role.
Yeah, literally,
to do that.
Beverly in that scene is saying, if the captain says it, that's what we do.
It just, yeah. I mean, and her role, Crusher might as well not have even showed up for First Contact.
Yeah.
So it goes to show you, I mean, when you've got a 2-hour story to tell, you can't service everybody. So the best you can get is a scene or two.
Yeah, and it, as you say, I mean, it in the third and fourth one, we sort of see there's like one spotlight scene for each of the secondary characters. It feels like.
Mm-hmm. At least it made it worth their while to show up. Yeah. Whereas in this one, it's nice to have them back, but anybody could have done what Sulu does in this movie.
Yeah, and with that point, I mean, had the secondary characters decided not to come back, would we have missed them?
To be, you know what? You know who would have missed them? The convention fans.
Sure.
Because the convention fans, and I think you made this point, the convention fans made these characters out to be much more important than they were in the actual series.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like we look at these movies now. We're like, oh my gosh, you got to have Chekhov or whatever. But let's say Walter Koenig was like, hey, you know what? I'm busy. I'm not going to do it.
Right.
Being absolutely honest, probably wouldn't have missed him.
We would have missed Scotty.
Sure.
Because he made an indelible mark.
Yeah.
We would have missed Uhura because of her importance to the legacy of the show. I think people would have been sort of like, if they had stuck another Asian man at the helm.
Sure.
People would have been pissed off, and if they had just stuck, a generic white guy, they would have said, "Well, where's Sulu?" And no offense to Walter Koenig, if Chekhov had not been there, I don't think anybody would have batted an eye.
Well, clearly, I mean, they did a whole series without Chekhov.
Right, right. Yeah, they replaced him with an alien.
They just stuck, James Doohan voiced
three-armed alien in his place. No, yeah, I mean, it wasn't necessary, to bring every single person back. It was more of a nostalgia thing, and obviously it worked out because Chekhov did go on to bigger and better things in the later movies.
Yeah.
But you make a very valid point, and is that would we have really missed the secondaries if they hadn't come back for this one? And I think as long as we had Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and to a lesser extent Scotty and Uhura, I think we would have all been fine. Yeah,
that's really, I mean, when it comes like this scene right here, I feel like this is one of the scenes that basically got Nimoy on board because this is like. They give him a mountain of exposition, but it's delivered in a way that's interesting. Visually
well, it's funny you say it that way because the scene that really got him on board, which it comes later, got cut from the film.
They cut it, right?
And he, that's one of the reasons why he had unfortunately, why he had such negative feelings about this film because. What he felt was the most pivotal Spock scene he'd ever played got cut. I guess we'll talk
about it when we get there, yeah.
When we get there. But, he went to see the director's cut where it was back in. And to be fair, it was in the longer cut that ABC showed when they first premiered the film on television. It was in there too. But he went to see the premiere of the director's cut, and it was back in, and he was very gratified that it was back in, but he'd been so long, 20 years, 15 years of hating the movie, that as soon as like the afterglow of the director's cut kind of wore off, he went right back to his default position, which was that the motion picture sucked, basically. And it kind of hurt the people who worked on the director's cut because they were so proud of the fact that they worked it back in, and he was so complimentary to them. And then I guess a few months later he was taking pot shots at the motion picture again. I guess he was just so used to it.
Yeah, it's an easy target. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think I like this scene a lot, and I think it illustrates, at least to me, why playing a Vulcan does not mean being emotionless.
A stiff, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think so many other people have played Vulcans, but nobody did it the way Leonard Nimoy did. And I would include Zachary Quinto even. I think Quinto, I like his take, but it's very different. I mean, he's
too emotional in my opinion.
It is, and we can sort of in canon be like, well, because it's a different version of Spock.
Right. You know who I thought did a good job playing a Vulcan? The guy Barry Atwater, who played Surak in
on Enterprise.
Which one?
Was he on Enterprise?
No, the original series. Sarek. Not Sarek. Surak.
In the Savage Curtain.
Savage Curtain, yeah.
I don't know why I know that.
I thought he was good.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm sure you know, this is actually a reshoot of this sequence.
Oh, I actually didn't know that.
The original version of this sequence, Kirk goes with him.
Oh, no kidding.
Into V'ger, yeah. Kirk figures out that Spock is out there, and he goes.
So Kirk goes after him.
And Kirk goes after him, and they go into V'ger together. And Kirk gets attacked by these crystalline creatures, and he gets covered with them. It's almost like a swarm of crystals cover up Kirk's body. Spock is so obsessed with V'ger that he leaves Kirk behind.
Okay.
And Sulu or Chekhov yells into the intercom, "Mr. Spock, you have to save the captain." And Spock kind of reluctantly turns around and shoots the crystals off of Kirk's body with his phaser.
This is the first I've heard of that.
You know what? If you can get your hands on the Marvel Comics adaptation, it's in there.
Oh, it is? Okay. See, I
Yeah.
have the comics. I just never read it.
You have the Marvel version?
I have it bound. I have it sitting in my garage, the whole Marvel series, but
Okay. The original Marvel from the 70s.
the 70s one, yeah.
Okay. Make it your business to go to the garage, pull it out, and if you want to see what the original trip through V'ger was supposed to be like, read that version, because they based it off of an outdated script.
How funny. Wow.
Yeah.
So
And of
this
course,
is
now
where Spock has kind of figured out what that V'ger is seeking, the same thing he's seeking. No,
Yes.
it's in they're both
Well, he's
they're kindred.
He's
They're
figured
kindred
out.
spirits.
He's figured out what V'ger is, and what's going through V'ger's mind.
Right. This is where he takes Kirk's hand and he's like, this simple feeling.
It's beyond V'ger's comprehension, right?
I feel like that's a line that launched 1,000 /fiction stories.
Oh, it didn't launch it. It just sort of furthered it.
It put booster rockets on it.
Yeah. And there's that great, it's asking questions. Is this all that I am? Is there nothing more?
Which
I
think that centrality, that idea, was something that if we would have somehow gotten there sooner, I think audiences would have glommed onto it much more easily, because I think that is something that people can relate to on some level.
Mm-hmm.
I love, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but I mean at the end, what more is there than the universe? I mean, these are big ideas, and that's where Star Trek can be at its best. And
that did make it very Star Trek, in the fact that at the end, it's not about destroying V'ger, it's about helping V'ger along on its journey.
Right.
And that, to me, separates this Star Trek from any other franchise.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
It's not about blowing it up. It's about this thing does not mean to be a threat. It doesn't mean it's not evil. And we have it it's our capacity to help this thing along. That's what we have to do, and that's what set it apart from Star. You got to remember the times in which this came out. This was on the heels of Star Wars.
Yeah.
It was around the same time as Alien, and then on the other end of the spectrum, you had the Black Hole, which was just not even in this league.
Yeah.
So that's what was going on, and that's what kind of set Star Trek apart. I don't know if Paramount would have been happier if this was all about, we got to find a way to blow up V'ger, we got to find a way to defeat it, we got to find a way to get rid of it. And, I give the filmmakers a lot of credit for sticking to their guns and saying this is the Star Trek way of doing this, of handling this kind of situation,
Right.
helping it along.
Yeah, and I don't know. This is something certainly that I've come to appreciate much more as an adult, and certainly as a parent. Is the Star Trek approach is let's try to understand, let's figure this out, let's work together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not let's just train all weapons on it and blow it to hell. And I think when we look at both the first and the second movies, I mean, we see, like you said, neither is more or less Trek than the other. They're just different aspects of what makes this franchise work.
Mm-hmm.
I think objectively, the second film is a vastly better movie, in my opinion. And I don't think I'm alone in that. But I think when I look at this with this one, it's aspects of the execution more than the story itself that are flawed.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it would have gotten criticism if they had gone with this story. It was going to get criticism no matter what. But there were ways that you could have done this that would have worked and would have been a much more enjoyable experience, for Trekkers and Trekkies and non-Trekkers and non-Trekkies alike. With more of an emphasis on the human characters and more an emphasis on conflicts between them. You've got this ready-made conflict between the captain of the ship and the guy he just replaced. Why was it dropped? Why didn't it become more of a subplot throughout the movie? Play with it, McCoy. I mean, why couldn't they find more for him to do?
Yeah.
He keeps coming up to the bridge and staring at the view screen
Just
and then
hanging
turning
out.
around and going off the bridge. Why is he? Is he just there to remind everybody that he's back? I mean, there was just so many things. And Kirk, what's going on between him? McCoy is there. Why is there no scene where he and McCoy just kind of sit down and say, what have these last 3 years been like for him?
Yeah.
Kirk. Everything is alluded to, but it's all subtext. There's nothing head on that you can really latch onto, and they corrected that so much with Wrath of Khan.
Yeah. Well, and that's
because that's
no. Go ahead, Glenn.
I was just going to say. I mean, Nicholas Meyer, when he signed on to do Star Trek II, one of the famous quotes he said was, "I had no interest in doing a movie about spaceships, but I did have interest in doing a movie about the people who live on them."
Yeah.
And that's what this movie is missing.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Well, and the narrative through line of the Wrath of Khan is Kirk's struggle with aging.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's something that it doesn't matter what century it is. That we can relate to,
Well, here, like I said, there's so many ideas here that are sort of like introduced, and these seeds are planted, and nothing ever comes of them. Here's this guy. He hasn't been in command for several years. He's a little rusty. He doesn't know this ship. And they play with that at the beginning, and then all of a sudden, he's overcome it, and we don't
know why.
Right.
Like,
we're
how
not
did he
with him
overcome?
on that journey.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating because you and I are both coming at a place where we like this movie.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like, oh, why does it suck? It's like, how could it have been even better?
Right. Yeah, and it is the execution. I mean, the sets are beautiful. The ship is beautiful. You had the top special effects guys, John Dykstra, Douglas Trumbull, doing this, and I think we just missed the scene. The missing
Yeah,
scene.
this is where it would have been, right?
Because Nimoy's eyes look a little red. And okay, so let's talk about it.
Go ahead. Yeah.
They're locked. They're still locked in V'ger, and Kirk asks Spock for some information, and Spock doesn't answer. And Kirk gets up and goes over to Spock to basically, deal with him face to face. Like, why is Spock not answering me? And Spock turns, and he's crying. And Kirk says, "Not for us." And Spock goes, "No, Captain, not for us. For V'ger. I weep for V'ger as I would for a brother.
Yeah.
As I was when I first came aboard, so is V'ger now." Okay, and then further he says something along the lines of, what is V'ger seeking? What does V'ger want? And Spock says, at some point in our lives, we all turn to someone, a father, a brother, a god, and we ask, why am I here? What was I meant to do? And what was I meant to be? And then Kirk responds, is this all I am? Is this all I am? Is there nothing more?
Yeah.
And that one line, as I was when I came aboard, so is V'ger now, empty, cold. That was it. That was Spock reaching the realization that, the path that he had been going on was wrong.
Yeah. Logic isn't enough.
And he's found himself.
Yeah.
And the thought that he's now open enough and in touch with himself now enough that he can openly weep in sympathy for V'ger, that was an important moment, and they cut it.
Yeah, of all the things to cut, right?
Oh, I mean, I can imagine just how furious Nimoy must have been, because in all likelihood, he wrote that scene.
Right. I'd like to point out here, though, this moment right here, this is like classic Kirk. This is like when he outsmarts Nomad.
Right.
It's, it's
or Baylock.
like,
yeah.
Yeah, it's just Kirk's brinksmanship and just his ability to, this is like right out of the show.
Yeah, but we never get to see how he gets to that point.
Right.
Let's see that progression of him getting his mojo back. But
I mean, I wonder,
what I was going to say. Yeah.
Picking up on what you were saying, though, I mean, I wonder if Nimoy wanted to highlight Spock's vulnerabilities. Mm-hmm. Shatner did not want to highlight Kirk's vulnerabilities. Right, because we know from Star Trek 2, he didn't like the stuff about Kirk getting old. That was stuff he had to be dragged into kicking and screaming. So I mean, this is a very interesting perspective on both of these performers. You know. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was material that maybe did highlight Kirk's, feet of clay or what have you, that he kind of wanted to move on from. You know.
Well, I got news for you. I mean, have you ever read the novelization?
I haven't.
A lot of that's in the novelization.
Yeah.
And there actually is a scene, and I wonder if it was in the script, if they filmed it, or if this was just something that Roddenberry added to the novel. There is a scene where Kirk goes to the sick bay, and McCoy says to him, "I've just made it official. Captain James T. Kirk is commanding this starship." And I'm paraphrasing because it's been years since I've read it. Mm-hmm. And Kirk was like, why did it take you so long? Because McCoy's been on the ship for a while at this point. It's like, why is he only getting now into making it official that Captain James T. Kirk is the commanding officer? And McCoy says, well, because now you finally are Captain James T. Kirk. Huh. You're finally the guy I finally recognize you again.
See,
so it was
it's. I mean, that's the stuff that makes the character interesting, right?
Yeah.
It's working through the. I mean, when you look at Star Trek 2, one of the best scenes in the film is the birthday scene with Kirk and McCoy. Mm-hmm. Right. It's when he's talking to Carol Marcus. I feel old, worn out.
Right.
And it's odd to me that's stuff that William Shatner sort of shied away from. I don't know why, but I mean, I would think as an actor,
vanity.
Yeah, but I mean, as a performer, that I would think that's what you want to play. Those are the moments that give you the most meat.
Well, according to Nicholas Meyer, the way he got Shatner to sort of sign on for that kind of stuff was he compared Shatner. He goes, you kind of remind me of whose career you can sort of have. And I don't know if this was pure coincidence or Nicholas Meyer knew that how Shatner felt about this guy. He goes, you could have a career like Spencer Tracy. You could age gracefully and be as much of a leading man into your later years as you were, And Shatner was like, "Oh wow, oh okay," and that's what sort of convinced them, to sort of go along with the whole aging thing and accept it gracefully. Yeah. The comparison to Spencer Tracy.
That's really funny. And the one thing I will say about William Shatner, as far as aging gracefully, he looks fantastic.
Yeah. I should be so lucky.
I mean, he's
I really hope I am.
Yeah, I mean, for somebody who's in his mid-80s at this point, I mean, he's hale and vigorous and good for him. So
and sharp and yeah. I mean, by cutting out that Spock moment, it really was. It was a shame, and I can only I don't know how I can convey to somebody who missed out the first time watching the ABC TV version the night that it aired for the first time and seeing that scene in there when it wasn't when I wasn't in the theatrical version, and I remember watching it with my brother and sister, and we were like looking at each other like, whoa. I don't remember this, and it was like, yeah, because it wasn't there. Now I knew about the scene because it's in the Marvel comic.
Oh, okay.
But I'd never seen it played out. I'd never seen it acted. I just assumed it was one of those lost scenes that you wouldn't get to see. So it was great. It was just great that it was in there, and it helped sell the character arc for Spock to such an important degree.
Now, this part over here, I can't remember. Is it explained in the film why they can't just beam, like, closer?
It is not explained, no.
Because that seems
all it says is that, yeah.
That's a big walk. That's all I'm saying.
Well, it's the 23rd century. They're very health conscious, and it's good exercise.
There you go.
Of course, in the director's cut, you see that sort of bridge form between the ship and V'ger. If you remember, these sort of pegs that they're stepping on.
That's right.
We see them form in the director's cut
as they're going.
Which was
So there it is. There's Voyager.
There's Voyager 6, except
Voyager
they don't
6,
know it yet. But
have we launched Voyager 6 yet? I feel like we're a few. We need to catch up to the fake history.
We're way behind. Now, my brother claimed, because I didn't see this with him. He was probably still up in, college in Buffalo when this came out. But he claimed that the minute Ilea said, "I am from the vessel V'ger," or whatever her line, upon the first mention of the word V'ger, he figured out the entire ending.
Really?
Yeah,
wow.
That's what he claimed. But I wonder if other people, if it was that obvious to other people.
Well, it's less obvious than ENSA, right?
Oh, that would have been ridiculous. The other thing I want to mention is that the way the director's cut is edited, the bond between Decker and Ilea seems to be a lot more pronounced and a lot stronger. So it doesn't seem so out of left field when Decker says, I'm going to be the one to merge with V'ger, so he can be with her. It seems to be much more to the fore. I mean, and it's subtle, but certainly more so than less subtle than it is here.
Well, and that's kind of the problem, really, is that Decker as a character really has no function in the broader narrative. And so to an extent, the ending is the only ending they could have had. And apparently, if you from at least from what I remember in William Shatner's book, Star Trek Movie Memories, they didn't know the ending. They had to kind of figure it out on the fly. And they landed on...
Originally, and again, according to this book that I'm reading now, up until pretty late in the game, Roddenberry was pushing. Decker was always going to be the one to merge with V'ger. That was, once this became a movie, that was always going to be the case. That it was going to be Decker.
Okay.
But Roddenberry's idea was that even here, the original Ilea would have returned.
Interesting. See, to me, definitely having the two of them merge with V'ger, that makes a certain amount of narrative sense based on what we've seen in the film. Mm-hmm. Right.
Right.
Stephen Collins here, by the way, we should mention, he's really good as Decker.
Yeah, he is.
Unfortunately, it's impossible to view him in a positive light with stuff that's come out about him recently, which I'm sure you're aware of.
Yeah.
But, him and Catherine Hicks from Star Trek 4, were the played husband and wife for, 28 years on Seventh Heaven.
I'm sure they traded a lot of Shatner stories.
I'm sure they did, yeah. He was on another show that I really liked, Tales of the Gold Monkey.
Oh, yeah, I watched that religiously, sure.
Yeah, Roddy McDowall was on that show.
Mm-hmm.
See, so this right here, I mean, I love all this because this really, it took a while, but we end up at what feels like a classic TOS episode here.
Yeah.
And I mean, you mentioned it feels that way because it's literally just pulling pieces from those episodes. But, even the execution, what we land at the end here, right? I mean, I think what's so interesting is the best of Roddenberryan idea is this idea that humanity is worth it. Humanity is exceptional. Mm-hmm. Humanity, it can be the magic ingredient. And that, that's literalized here, right? What V'ger needs is the human element. And it's kind of interesting because I feel like Roddenberry was at odds with himself in that regard, because I think his view of humanity was at some point became not human. If that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. Because he envisioned a world where people didn't act like people anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, those first few seasons of Next Generation,
Yeah.
I mean, those characters were just so...
They were ciphers, you know?
Yeah, so unrelatable.
Yeah. I mean, I think Next Generation, just like the original series, it's at its best when it shows the characters dealing with human issues and sure, overcoming them. But, I mean, I think of episodes, for example, like The Drumhead, which is from like the 5th or 6th season, where you have, I think it's Jean Smart. She's this like...
Gene Simmons.
Gene Simmons, I'm sorry. Gene Smart is from Designing Women. Right? Gene Simmons.
Right.
But she's like this racist admiral, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the idea that we will lick racism in 200 years, I mean, it'd be nice, but
Right.
that flies in the face of human history.
Yeah, and for me, Next Generation started showing signs of life. I guess it was the 3rd season when my best friend in college, he stuck with it. I was long gone by that point. And he told me there was this episode I had to check out. And it was one of the Q episodes. And I guess it's the one where Q loses his powers.
Oh, yeah. Q-less.
And he makes this comment to Riker towards the end of the episode. He goes, again, I don't remember the exact dialogue, but it was like, Riker, you're such a stiff. I don't remember you being like this before the beard. And I was like, wow, they're being self-referential and they're making fun of themselves. Wow, maybe there is hope for this show. And I kept hearing about how good Next Generation was getting towards the end of the 3rd season, and I started tuning back in, and it had improved. And yeah, I mean, it wasn't perfect, but the characters, especially Riker, who to me was just a big, puffed up, bag of air, in the first season. I'm sorry. But he was really likable by the time I started tuning back in. I was like, okay, this guy's cool.
Yeah.
He's really cool.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I mean, I think they figured out what made that show work, which was, I mean, I think, by the way, the reason that The Next Generation is still fairly beloved today is because it is so different from the original series. I mean, it is its own thing.
Right.
And, I think there's a philosophy that's similar across the board in that what the franchise represents. But I think, I think they figured that out, and I'm so, again, going through it now as an adult, really for the first time. I mean, that's something I'm appreciating much more.
But let's not make no mistake. The terrible episodes are still terrible episodes.
Well, I mean,
Code of Honor. In any universe.
Planet of the Black People, as I call it.
Oh, what were they thinking?
There's this. Yeah, that was a mistake on a whole host of levels.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like number 3 out the chute, that's not helpful either.
Right. Yeah.
So we're kind of like it's in the wind up here, and I feel like what might have also been a problem is that V'ger is not an entity in the traditional sense, and so his and I don't even know if we can call him a him, right? But its wants and its arc, its journey is not something that the audience can really relate to. And I wonder if it might have been helpful to have an avatar for V'ger that could interact more directly rather than having sort of the ILEA probe, which serves that function. Maybe like I feel like if this movie was made today, we would see some kind of visualization, like a holographic person or something. You know what I mean?
Well, the original idea for ILEA was she was not going to be the ILEA probe. Was she was not going to be so robotic. I mean, she was going to be more sort of interactive and more related, be able to relate to the crew more. I'm not sure why they went in this direction, but in the original version, I guess it was, in the In Thy Image version and some of the subsequent drafts, she wasn't going to be, this remote as a character.
So, I mean, to me, that goes to directorial choice too. Then, I mean, I think that.
And the writing. I mean, the writing again and again.
And the actor. To be honest,
I
I mean, Persis Kambata. who, I mean, God rest her soul, but I mean, she wasn't a good actor.
This is the only thing I ever saw her in, so I couldn't even make that judgment about what
I mean,
whether or not
she was in
able.
Indian films and whatnot, but I mean, she was coming from a place of having trouble with the language. I mean, and
Was she really?
Yeah, I mean, because
Yeah.
this is her, because she did this and one or two other American things.
Like Nighthawks.
Yeah, and like I remember her from like episodes of like an episode of MacGyver,
Oh my God, I didn't even know about that.
Yeah, and she.
Okay, I guess she wasn't good in that either.
Yeah, and again, it is what it is, but I think that's part of it too, because it is kind of an integral role.
Yeah. Certainly visually iconic. But,
it really is. This scene right here.
Yeah.
And the music is just beautiful.
Just her as the character. I mean, just her as Ilea, visually iconic image in the Star Trek, I guess, franchise or history. But I
don't know that I ever bought this idea that Deltans are so sensual that like everyone around them just kind of loses their, like there's this cut scene where Sulu
right.
Sulu turns straight for a second when he's around.
Yeah.
When he's around.
The problem by cutting that scene, and this confused me for quite a while until I realized what they were trying to say. But by cutting that scene, I thought, and certainly my sister thought, because she explained it to me incorrectly as it turned out. But when she says my oath of celibacy is on record, that we took that to mean that all Starfleet officers signed an oath of celibacy.
But it's her specifically.
But it's her specifically, and you figure that out in the subsequent Sulu scene where she says, I've signed an oath of celibacy, Mr. Sulu. That makes me as safe as any human female. Without that scene, you think that, she's just like everybody else. She signed an oath of celibacy to be on the Enterprise.
Sure.
So what my sister and I interpret that to mean is everybody on the Enterprise is celibate.
Right, which is like, okay, well, you don't need to announce that. We get it.
Right. It was bizarre. Again, it's a case of cutting. If you make an edit that makes the film more confusing, it's not a good edit.
Right.
So.
But honestly though, that goes to that's a lot of stuff we don't really need about the Deltans, because none of that is applicable in this film. I mean, the oath of celibacy. If she just didn't say that, it doesn't matter.
You're right. They should have cut that. That's what they should have cut about the oath of celibacy.
Yeah.
They should have just cut that reference, and it would have been,
And
it would have been fine.
I maybe this is just me, but I don't find a bald woman particularly alluring.
Well, I gotta say, I normally don't, but she was extraordinarily a beautiful woman.
She's very exotic looking, but I don't think it's the baldness. I think it's because she's attractive. I mean, I think
the bald. I find her attractive despite the bald head, not because.
Right.
So.
So here we're at this is like a traditional TOS ending right here.
Yep. Kirk speechifying and McCoy and Spock.
And Spock is back now finally.
Yeah. Yep. And there's some great stuff by Shatner here, because I think we gave it the ability to create its own sense of purpose out of our own human weakness, and the drive that compels us to overcome. And that was great. That is Star Trek.
Yeah. I mean, it's you can easily see an alternate reality where we had a whole series of sequels that followed in the aesthetic path of this film.
Yeah.
Which and Glenn, you kind of covered some of that ground in the comic series that you wrote. I feel like we've buried the lead here by not talking about the Untold Voyages.
Okay.
So I mean, you filled in basically the 10 years between the motion picture and Wrath of Khan.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, other people kind of beat me to it. Some of the novels and certainly the original Marvel series, covered some of that ground. I was blessed with hindsight, so I was able to sort of fill that space with a little bit more sort of fidelity to how things actually went. Again, I have a great deal of fondness for this era. I do love the uniforms. I love this version of the ship. And the fact that they skipped over so much in Star Trek II, when we get to Star Trek II, it's roughly 10 years later, and they're in different places in their lives. Chekhov is on another ship, and Spock is now the captain, and Kirk somehow managed to get himself back behind a desk, which is where he never wanted to be. And you've got this Savick character that's Spock's assistant. So, it just seemed to me that there was so much unexplored territory and so many missions that they went on between this and Wrath of Khan that there was a lot of fertile ground. And one of the things that I wanted to do was take a more sort of character-driven approach and not do so many plot-driven stories, which is what the Marvel series tended to do. And the Marvel series was sort of like the animated series, in that they just, in doing one-issue stories, they didn't have a lot of space to explore the characters.
They were like original series stories, but with motion picture uniforms.
Pretty much, yeah. But even so much, even less so than original series stories, almost like animated series stories. They couldn't go too deep. They only had, the animated show had 22 minutes to tell a story, and the Marvel series had 22 pages to tell a story.
Right.
Now, I was in the same sort of bind in that each issue was, I was telling one-issue stories, but what I tried to do was make the stories very character-centric. So the first issue focused on Kirk. Second issue focused on Spock. Third issue focused on McCoy. Fourth issue focused on the supporting characters. So I got rid of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy on page 2 and let the spotlight go on the supporting characters. And then the fifth issue, which was double-sized, focus was back on Kirk, and I wrote it as sort of like a movie, sort of like a cinematic scale, rather than these little intimate stories. And what I wanted to do, without doing a 5-part series, with each story leading into the other, I didn't do that. What I wanted to do is just sort of have the fifth issue, the last issue, sort of circle back to a theme I explored in the first issue, which was Kirk's career, basically.
Right.
In the first issue, Kirk is doing everything he can to stay in control of the Enterprise. This is where he needs to be. This is what he wants to be. When you get to the fifth issue, again, we know that he's going to go back to the Admiralty and get stuck behind a desk again. What brought him to that point? What made him think that was a good idea? And so that's what I really wanted to explore and get to that point, with Kirk, and that he's ready to sort of move on from the Enterprise again. It was a lot of fun to explore that, and do it in a way that didn't feel contrived, to make it feel sort of organic to that character, and to what we know happened afterwards.
Right. Well, and I think with that in mind, what happens afterwards, that's a good place to segue out of this commentary track as the credits are rolling. And I think that's teasing the path for what I hope will be our Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan commentary, coming soon. We don't know when, but it is coming.
We don't know when, but we just know it will.
Well, Glenn, this was an absolute blast, and it tells you something that the 2 hours and change just breezed by as we got our geek on.
I will say without exaggeration, this is the quickest version. This is the quickest run through of Star Trek: The Motion Picture that I've ever had.
I agree with you completely. So with that in mind, thank you everybody for listening, and thank you, Glenn, for joining us. And if you're looking for more movie commentary tracks, check out the Movie Film Show. Me and Brian Hall do a few. And Glenn, where can people find you online if they're interested in reaching out to you?
I'm on Twitter at Glenn L. Greenberg, and my blog is Glenn Greenberg's Grumblings .blogspot.com, and it's Glenn with 2 N's and Greenberg, B-E-R-G, Glenn Greenberg's Grumblings at blogspot.com.
And as for me, you can find me at Zacky's Corner. That's ZAKIS Corner. That's my Twitter handle. It's also my Instagram handle, ada.com. That's my website. And you can find the Movie Film Show at iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Google Play. Wherever you find podcasts, you'll find this show. And we will be back shortly with our next episode of Nostalgia Theater. Thank you, everybody, for listening.